Many Holocaust survivors said that one of the factors that allowed them to survive, that increased their determination to survive, was the desire to tell what they had experienced. They believed that the world needed to know, to learn a lesson. The final message of the survivors was and still is the slogan, often used and never denied by anyone: never again. Everyone agrees here. No more racism, no more anti-Semitism. I think this is a lesson what we as a society, as our civilization, basically have already learned. Anti-Semitism is bad. Racism is bad. Not only killing on the basis of religion, nationality or skin color was condemned, but also any type of violence, physical and verbal, or exclusion. When examining the Holocaust, we deal with Jews, Germans, Nazis, Poles, anti-Semites, etc. We analyze and classify various attitudes of various individuals and social groups. But in the end, we always come to the obvious truth. People brought this fate to other people. At this point, I will change the topic for a moment. We are talking about the Holocaust, about the crimes, about the genocide committed against the Jews nearly 100 years ago. I assume that many of you are listening to what I am saying in the context of what is happening in Gaza right now. I imagine that many of you condemn the actions of the Israeli army. Of course, you have the right to do so. I will not pursue this topic further. This is not what our meeting is about. But please, let's not confuse these two issues: the Holocaust and Israeli policy. I guarantee you that no Holocaust victim had anything to do with Benjamin Netanyahu's policies. The memory of the victims of the Holocaust must not be destroyed because of the contemporary policy of any country. Wars and crimes should all more motivate us to preserve the memory of what happened. Anyway, we want to study the Holocaust to implement the slogan "Never Again." We look at the Holocaust through the prism of history. We learn about what happened in order to draw conclusions. And we say no to anti-Semitism? Very well. The Holocaust can also be viewed through other prisms: philosophy, theology, anthropology, psychology. People doomed people to this fate. The Holocaust is like a mirror in which we, humans, can look at ourselves. The Holocaust is a great lecture on people and their behavior, ways of thinking. Human nature led to the Holocaust. To consider that the slogan "Never Again" has actually come true, it must be assumed that human nature has changed over the last 80 years. Has it changed or not? This question encourages us to look at ourselves and our times through the prism of the Holocaust. The extermination of the Jews is rightly considered an unprecedented crime. Its industrial nature is one thing, but above all, its uniqueness is demonstrated by the lack of an objective cause. The Jews were simply to be exterminated, all without exception, just because. Its cause was only stupid, evil, aggressive, and irrational hatred. Only that. Therefore, the Holocaust should seem completely unimaginable, completely insane. We all know that the Holocaust happened. Some group of people carried out the crime, most were indifferent, some counteracted it as best they could. But what amazed at least me is that everyone understood this crime. No one was holding their heads in disbelief. No one has experienced a shock, cognitive dissonance. The Holocaust was within the understanding of people at that time, even those opposed to the Nazis. People were perfectly aware that such hatred existed in the world. No one even asked why actually Jews were the target of this hatred. The crime was horrific. But from the perspective of the present, what is perhaps even more terrifying is that it was not a shock to anyone, and was even obvious to many people. The question is, why Jews? Jürgen Stroop, who was responsible for suppressing the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, claimed, "Jews are subhuman. They have different blood, different tissues, different bones, different thoughts than us." Today, such a claim seems absurd, but one must realize that people actually thought so. Where does this view come from? In short, because for centuries, Jews were a minority practicing Judaism in the Christian world. In people's mind of past centuries, matters of religion, God and Satan were of fundamental importance. They genuinely believed that Satan wanted to destroy Christianity and take over the world. Meanwhile, in the masses' minds, the Jews were identified with the enemies of Jesus Christ who led to his crucifixion. They were unfaithful killers of God. This made them enemies of Christianity and an ally of the devil, a synagogue of Satan opposed to the Church of God. Hence the belief in a Jewish conspiracy that would lead to their taking over the world. When the European nations become thoroughly absorbed in such thoughts over the generations, they automatically transferred them to contemporary times. In the era of the emergence of nation-states, ethnically alien Jews were still a problem, and still, in the eyes of many Europeans, they wanted to destruction, but not of Christianity, but of nation-states. How is it that extremely opposite stereotypes about the Jews exist side by side in the world? For example, at the same time, it is said that they are bankers, exploiters, capitalists, and that they created communism. Because over the centuries of functioning as enemies, they have been fused into one amorphous mess that transcends time and space. They did not consist of individual, autonomous and free human units, but were associated as a concept, uniform mass, hostile collective organism. They, Jews this, Jews that. Hence a whole host of superstitions and conspiracy theories, hence the contemptuous language, being locked in ghettos and being forced to wear distinctive signs, which took place centuries before Hitler. After all, both the ghettos and the markings on clothes, so-called signs of shame, had their origins in the Middle Ages, and the initiators of these practices were the Catholic clergy. The Jew became first the antithesis of the Christian, and finally the antithesis of man. Hence the belief in the otherness of Jews. Different thoughts, different tissues. After many centuries of this madness, Europe was finally ready for the final solution. These millions of human beings dying in gas chambers were, in the eyes of Hitler and his party, not individual people, but a mass, a collective organism understood as the antithesis of humanity, which they wanted to destroy. This is how the Holocaust occurred, which had many dark arenas. The most recognizable are Auschwitz-Birkenau and Treblinka. But there are others. Here, a few kilometers from us, there was such an arena. Less known, but exceptionally cruel. An absolutely unique place. A labor camp at the Hasag plant in Skarżysko-Kamiennej. Before the war, there were arms factories in Skarżysko. When German troops occupied Skarżysko, the factory was launched very quickly. Its management was taken over by the Hasag, Hugo Schneider Aktiengesellschaft concern from Leipzig. 3 camps were established, located at 3 departments of the factory: Works A, B, and C. These camps were established independently of the SS activities and even in some conflict. It was about the right to exploit Jews as a labor force. Hasag Skarżysko was not a concentration camp. It was founded by a private concern, and the guards were members of the factory guard, Werkschutz. Nazi ideology created space for action, but the real motivation was money. Hasag bought Jewish workers from the SS, and since the cost of bringing in new workers was cheaper than feeding the old ones, the conditions were terrible, worse than those in concentration camps run by the SS. Prisoners were fed mainly with soup made of potato flakes, often rotten. Due to hunger, prisoners sold their clothes and often wore only paper cement bags tied with string. The striped camp uniform was a luxury that was beyond the reach of Hasag prisoners. They worked with extremely toxic substances without any limits or protective measures. Hasag's symbol became a picric acid, which turned everything, including the bodies of prisoners, yellow. Everything caused a very high mortality rate. In Skarżysko, women and men were not separated, which had its good and bad sides. Good because families were not separated, but it also caused widespread sexual violence. Often, an only way for young women to survive was to become the lover of a prominent prisoner. It also happened that guards came to the camp to select women for rape, which usually ended with death. Even the highest management of the factory was not free from this. Apparently, the factory director, Egon Dalski, personally selected women for rape during a visit to Hasag by high-ranking officers from the SS headquarters of the Radom district. These stories are really heartbreaking. The Hasag organized the camps very cleverly. Internal Jewish management and police were established. These prominent prisoners were hated by the majority. The police were sadistic and corrupted. The management basked in luxury and was corrupted to the core. Imagine that when most were dying of hunger and toxins, dressed in paper bags, Commander Fela Markowiczowa could go shopping to the city, and even German directors sometimes came to her barrack, furnished like a normal house, for a cup of tea. Standard concentration camps were isolated from the outside world. Here, although conditions were much worse, prisoners met with Polish workers from outside every day. The advantage of this was the possibility of creating a developed black market and a greater chance of obtaining external help. But some of these ordinary people, civilian workers who returned to their homes every day, often committed violence motivated by antisemitism or simple sadism, ready to take advantage of the prisoners' tragic situation to rob them of everything. Since Hasag was an arms factory, the Polish underground was very active here. It was not a common case that the Jewish prisoners could engage in conspiration activities. This was indeed the case here. There are many testimonies about the Jews participating in acts of sabotage and ammunition theft. Hasag is the Holocaust in a nutshell. Not only because of a great overview of human attitudes in the face of extreme situations. In the final phase of the occupation was created improvised crematory, so-called frying pan, where the bodies of the murdered were burned. In addition to prisoners who died or were shot, some prisoners of war from many countries and members of the resistance movement were killed and burned here. There are also reports that the Jews from outside were brought to Skarżysko and immediately gassed in gas vans, as in Kulmhof. There is also a testimony about a train that came here straight from France, whose passengers were gassed and burned in Skarżysko. This information requires deeper investigation, but if it is true, Skarżysko could be included on the list of extermination centers. There are many terrifying stories in Hasag, clearly showing what one person can do to another when consumed by hatred. But these extreme situations also generated the best values. Prisoners tried to preserve their humanity by creating culture, practicing religion, and providing each other with selfless help and care. Recently, I heard a completely new story for me. In Werk B, Bronia Feldman, thanks to the help of a Polish employee who provided her with medicines and dressing materials, organized a secret infirmary in the camp. One of the guards, whose son was sick, found out about this. He had no access to a doctor, so he led her out of the camp and asked her to cure her son. Bronia showed the boy's mother how to reduce the fever and use cough inhalations. The situation repeated itself several times with other sick children of the guards. I say this because Bronia Feldman did it out of a sense of duty to help these in need, aware that children are not guilty of the sins of their fathers. What about today? We think we are smarter than people from years ago because we know, because we have learned our history lesson, and we know how dangerous is hatred based on religion, race, nationality. The word Holocaust comes from Greek and means a burnt offering. The sacrifice is to feed some gods or demons. While researching the Holocaust, I often asked myself which god this sacrifice was dedicated to. I answered myself that it was to the demons of unawareness, misunderstanding, fear, anxiety, ignorance, stupidity, complexes, jealousy, envy, aggression, anger, hatred, and pride. And they don't sleep. The world is full of these negative emotions and thoughts all the time. To be able to implement the Never Again slogan, we need to understand where these bad emotions come from. Each person, each of us, has a specific frames of thinking, mental maps by which person perceives the world. Every person has a specific puzzle in head about what is, how it is, and why, what is good and what is bad. These frames are largely imposed by civilization, but each person also has their own individual frames. And so it depends on the individual whether these frames are wide or tight, hard or flexible. They determine what we support, what we are indifferent to, what we can tolerate, what we won't reject, and ultimately, what are we able to destroy. Jews were fortunate and unfortunate at the same time that for centuries they had been balancing on the edge of the mental frames of Europeans. They were tolerated, but not always entirely wanted. Hence such creations as ghettos, those ghettos from centuries ago. Jews could live and function, but separately from Christians. They were to be separated by a wall so that their thoughts, views, and mental maps would not mix with Christian ones. In those days, this suited the Jews themselves. Okay, we will be safer behind the wall, in our own world, in our customs. Subsequent eras brought new conditions, but Jews were still an element of society that balanced on the edge of tolerance. The final was Auschwitz, Treblinka and Skarżysko. Today, Jews are not threatened in European societies because they do not violate the boundaries of our thought frames, thanks to which we know, or rather think we know, what is, how it is, and why. What is good and what is bad. But the fact that today Jews have moved from the boundaries of these frames to the center does not mean that these boundaries do not exist. Our horizons of view contain those uncomfortable points that are problematic. Accepting such points causes a domino effect in which the entire worldview falls apart. These thoughts came to my mind during the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you remember the level of verbal aggression on online forums regarding vaccinations? Mutual accusations of bringing destruction and death wishes. It was just such a moment when one man began to disturb the other, when a different view of some people became unacceptable to others. Why this topic? Because it concerned matters of health and life, especially when people were responsible not only for themselves, but also for their children. This is where our flexibility ends. The majority of society wanted to believe modern science, a global treatment model that was and is a ready-made, completed puzzle. Removing one piece from it destroys the credibility of the whole. But some said, I don't believe it. I don't trust it. I don't want it. In such a situation, it is easy to create idea, let's separate from them, because they are different. They have different tissues, bones and thoughts. Maybe settle them, or us, behind the wall. And from there it's only a step to the final solutions. Because tolerating people who think differently leads to undermining faith in everything I do and in the correctness of the decisions I make. It is difficult to tolerate people whose mere presence harms our mental well-being. Because what if they are right? It's better that they don't exist, because then everything will be simpler, and I won't have any dilemmas. We want to genuinely believe in what we do, think and say, especially when we are convinced that our way is the only one and there is no other. And it was exact dilemmas of people for whom religion was fundamental in old ages. And it is exactly where anti-Semitism came from. This is one topic. But let's look at the present day. How quickly the world is developing and changing. Revolution follows revolution, and there are and will be people who will not keep up with it. Artificial intelligence will soon enter our everyday lives. Neural links connecting brains with computers, genetic modifications. All this will bring new threats, new diseases, new methods of treatment, and new forms of struggle to be or not to be. Could genetically modified people, equipped with interfaces connecting their brains directly to the internet, consider themselves superhumans? Or, conversely, could they be dehumanized by those who would prefer to stay classic Homo sapiens? The future will certainly bring new divisions to us and them, and the return of the fact that there are people who are different, have different tissues, different bones, different thoughts. We will probably be confronted with a situation when another person, objectively innocent, will cause us confusion because he will mess with our mental maps, and we would like to see him dead, or at least behind the wall. The world is changing so quickly, and it's getting harder and harder to trust anyone. There was a time when a large percentage of European society thought that Jews were evil. They believed that Jews wanted to destroy the world they knew and liked. And even if their obsessions did not go that far, they saw the very presence of Jews in society as a threat to the quality of their world, their thoughts, a sense of faith in one's own views. We think we are smarter than people from 100 years ago, because we would be able to say no to anti-Semitism, no to racism. Really? Saying no to old, anachronistic, discredited ideologies is not difficult, especially if our view is shared by the majority. Ideologies like Nazism and communism attracted people 100 years ago because they were new and fresh. They were truly seductive, and people genuinely wanted to believe in them. If we want to be sure that we are really working towards never again idea, let's imagine what seduces us today. Who today presents us with a beautiful vision of the world that we like, understand, and want to believe in. But what if there appears a group that will spoil this vision with its very presence, just because they do not believe in it and do not consider it to be the only right one? What if the leaders who we like and trust point the finger at these others and say that if we want to keep our purity of thoughts, our self-confidence, we need to get rid of them? Of course, we theorize and speak hypothetically, but still, saying no to old, evil ideologies is not difficult. But to say no to what we want to believe in already is. If we want to be sure that when the time of testing comes, we will authentically call never again, we must be ready for such a conflict. Conflict with ourselves, often with society, friends, families. We may become victims of exclusion and hatred. People who opposed totalitarian regimes when they were at the zenith of their power faced such dilemmas. These were the decisions of the righteous among the nations. The Holocaust is a topic that cannot be learned. It's a topic that can be studied over and over again, just as religious Jews can discuss the Torah over and over again, or Christians over the death of Jesus. Keep finding new meanings and new contexts. And the Holocaust is an endless mine of inspiration, thoughts, and conclusions. It is a source of inspiration for artists, philosophers, and scientists. As the last survivors pass away more and more quickly, we need to draw even more from this source. Skarżysko itself could and even should become one of these centers where, through research of the Holocaust, new paths that would allow the world to become a better place could be sought. In addition to the lesson of the Holocaust, which tells us what stupid, completely irrational hatred leads to, we also have a lesson from Hasag. A lesson about more demons. Greed. Because greed was the foundation of this hell. The greed of companies, the greed of individual people, privileged prisoners, civilians, dishonest traders, guards and supervisors. Depravity of power, sexual violence. This relay of evil is clearly visible here, where almost everyone who had even a bit of power over another person turned into a monster. About how ordinary people turned into beasts in the absence of control and potential punishment. Perhaps nowhere else we can see that in the first place it was people who brought this fate to people. Speaking and teaching about the Holocaust is a mission that helped to survive those whose fate forced to go through this hell. It is our responsibility to take over this mission. Never again is not about the past, but about the future. Never ever in the future. Therefore, digging into history is not enough. This is just a beginning. The real difficulty is examining the present, finding these toxic patterns in the world around us and in ourselves. It is also a constant development of the positive qualities of each of us, building love, empathy, compassion and tolerance. Trying to understand other person even if it is difficult. Learning to build bridges instead of walls. Creating such an ability to distinguish good from evil that even when our own beloved mental frames are falling into pieces, we will be able to stand on the right side. Only then will the slogan never again be able to come true.